Yes, ma'am.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us as we introduce a very crucial piece of legislation. I am grateful to be standing here with my partners. Senator Bob Menendez will be joined shortly by Senator Richard Blumenthal, as well as my sister in reproductive justice movement, Congresswoman Barbara Lee. And I want to recognize the incredible, relentless defenders of women and human rights, the Center for Reproductive Rights, Planned Parenthood Federation of America, and Human Rights Watch. In 2017, without warning or justification, President Trump's State Department deleted all sections and references to women's health and rights from their annual rights report. True to form, this White House is attacking women by erasing them. Documenting and reporting human rights violations is central to eradicating them. Without this report, the U.S. cannot monitor, assess, and ensure that women can access maternal, sexual, and reproductive health services. This report is a direct connection to the women and families seeking asylum at our southern border. The State Department's Human Rights Report is used by immigration judges and asylum officers to grant women in dangerous situations the refuge they need as they come to our border fleeing sexual violence and assault. Again, the Trump administration is turning its back on our legacy as a country of sanctuary. It is turning its back on women. And today, we are taking action. We are introducing the Reproductive Rights Are Human Rights Act to require the State Department to report on women's health and rights around the world and here at home. Regardless of who sits in the Oval Office, the U.S. government must serve as an advocate and watchdog for women's fundamental reproductive rights, because women's rights are human rights. Now I would like to introduce the bill sponsor in the Senate, Senator Menendez.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman. I'm so pleased to be joining Congresswoman Clark and Congresswoman Lee, and I know my colleague Senator Blumenthal hopefully will be here shortly, as well as Senator Shaheen, as well as the Center for Reproductive Rights, Planned Parenthood, Human Rights Watch, and so many allies in our fight for women's rights. We come together today on the eve of International Women's Day to firmly and unapologetically say that reproductive rights are human rights. Many wonder why we say this. Why now? Secretary Clinton famously said that women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights, and she is right. But as the senior Democrat, the ranking member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I know that we cannot leave what constitutes women's rights up to the interpretation of the Trump administration. We must be unequivocal in maintaining that women's rights are human rights, and human rights include reproductive rights. Since President Trump took office, this basic principle has been under assault, from confirming anti-choice judges to attacking Title X funding to eliminating reproductive rights from the State Department's annual country reports on human rights. When we say reproductive rights, we're talking about women's access to health care, to comprehensive sex education, to quality prenatal and maternity care, to family planning, and yes, to safe and legal abortion. The State Department's omission of reproductive rights from this report threatens its very integrity. Congress needs this information to gauge the human rights records of nations seeking United States assistance and more broadly to shape U.S. foreign policy. So today we're introducing the Reproductive Rights Are Human Rights Act because it's not up to the Trump administration to pick and choose which rights matter to the health and well-being of billions of women worldwide. The harsh reality is that in too many countries around the world, it is still entirely acceptable for women and girls to be mutilated by zealots, stoned by mobs, raped by spouses, and denied education, autonomy over their bodies, and control of their lives. Our legislation will ensure the State Department's report gives us the facts, not alternative facts, not a politically motivated selection of the facts. We know that when nations respect reproductive rights, women are more likely to succeed. And when women succeed, their families succeed, their communities succeed, entire nations succeed. Ultimately, that success depends on us building a safer, more prosperous world for the American people and all people. That's why we fight for reproductive rights, and this is why we're introducing the Reproductive Rights or Human Rights Act today. It's time we put reproductive rights back into the State Department's country reports on human rights, because we know that's exactly where they belong. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank our Senate author, Senator Menendez, for your tremendous leadership on this issue and on so many human rights issues. Thank you so much. And also to Katherine Clark, who is a bold and visionary sister woman, warrior woman, who takes the lead on so many issues that are so important to human rights and to women throughout the world. And of course, to all of our women warriors and our men warriors, thank you all very much for staying the course and for being here today with us and making sure that this bill will receive the co-sponsorship support it needs and that it will pass and get to the White House. This bill would require the State Department to include reproductive rights in its annual human rights report. After, of course, as you know, the Trump administration deleted all of those sections without justification or warning. Regardless of who sits in the Oval Office, our government should serve as an advocate for women's fundamental reproductive rights. Protecting and advancing women's rights should remain front and center in our diplomacy. I serve on the State and Foreign Operations Subcommittee of the Appropriations Committee, and I know throughout the world how important this issue is. Also, as co-chair of the Pro-Choice Caucus, women's reproductive rights are human rights. This is a matter of justice. It's a matter of equality, and it's a matter of human rights. The United States cannot turn its back on the countless women around the world who are deprived of basic reproductive rights and failing to just report, mind you. What are they trying to hide? Just to report on women's reproductive rights, it does just that. So I'm very proud to be lead co-sponsor of the Reproductive Rights or Human Rights Act, because if President Trump and Secretary Pompeo won't stand up for women in the world, then we will. We fought against policies like the ones currently being pushed by this administration, like the global gag rule, which undermine abortion access abroad. This cruel policy puts lives at risk just to score a few cheap political points. It also undermines our longstanding foreign aid priorities, like fighting gender-based violence and ending HIV and AIDS. And it will mean, of course, lost lives. So it's time to stop playing politics with women's lives. We must fight to protect women's health and tirelessly pursue reproductive justice for all. We're no longer on the defensive, and together we're going to fight. So I want to thank you so much for being here. I want to thank you for your support. And I'm very optimistic that we're going to win this fight, because human rights are extremely important to women throughout the world, and reproductive rights certainly are human rights. So thank you again. Now I'd like to welcome Senator Blumenthal to the podium,
so much.
And appreciate your tremendous leadership and being on the board.
Thank you to Representatives Lee and Clark. Thanks to my great colleague, Bob Menendez, who has been such a champion of human rights around the world. Thank you, Bob. We shouldn't have to be here, right? We shouldn't have to be standing literally in the shadow of the United States Capitol asking for reinstatement, not something new, not novel, not original. It was done until just a couple of years ago. reporting on desecration and destruction of women's lives around the world. What are we afraid of knowing? That women have been mutilated and persecuted? Who are we afraid of embarrassing? Despots and dictators, tyrants that Donald Trump has cozied up to and cultivated in his own personal interests? Whose interests are we serving by turning a blind eye to the destruction of human rights, which are reproductive rights? The answer is we are betraying American values. We are denigrating the trust we have as the world's greatest nation in the history of this planet. We are refusing to know about lives of women and girls that hang in the balance. And so I defy my Republican colleagues, or any of my colleagues, to vote against this bill. I defy Donald Trump to veto this bill. Let the world know who we are as a nation. Let's stand for reproductive rights, which are human rights. Thank you all for being here today.
Good afternoon. My name is Susan Inman, and I am Chief Counsel for Federal Policy and Advocacy at the Center for Reproductive Rights. On behalf of the Center for Reproductive Rights and the entire International Family Planning Coalition, as well as the 93 diverse organizations that endorse this bill, I want to start by saying thank you to Representatives Clark and Lee, Senator Blumenthal, Senator Menendez. I know Representatives Engel and Lowy, Senator Shaheen, who couldn't be here today, for your just incredible leadership to ensure that the United States government recognizes reproductive rights as fundamental human rights worthy of protection and promotion both at home and abroad. As you've heard, the reproductive rights or human rights that you've introduced today will ensure that the U.S. State Department includes comprehensive reporting on reproductive rights in its annual country reports on human rights practices, rather than trying to erase reproductive rights from the global discourse, as the administration tried to do last year. Access to reproductive health care has repeatedly been recognized as a protected human right, impacting the right to life, health, equality, and non-discrimination, and freedom from cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment. The Center for Reproductive Rights is proud to endorse this legislation because it embodies the core of our mission to use the power of law to advance reproductive rights as fundamental human rights around the world. Since 1992, our attorneys have used constitutional law and international human rights law around the globe to expand access to reproductive care and rights, and ensure that every person can participate with dignity as an equal member of society. When the State Department suddenly deleted the reproductive rights section from the Human Rights Report last year, those reproductive rights violations did not disappear in the world. Those violations need to be brought to light, which is why the Center is currently litigating with Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher a FOIA complaint to ensure that we can get information and documents about those deletions. And thanks to this legislation, we will hopefully never see those deletions happen again. Before I pass things along to my colleagues at Human Rights Watch and Planned Parenthood, I want to share one story about why this human rights reporting matters. In El Salvador, the Center's Latin American and Caribbean team represents a number of women who were jailed after suffering miscarriages and are serving decades-long prison sentences. These women are known as Las 17. The State Department's 2016 Human Rights Report on El Salvador contained detailed reporting on Las 17, which was used by human rights advocates on the ground to put pressure on the government to rectify these grave human rights violations. That pressure has been working, with some of these women obtaining release from prison. But the 2017 Human Rights Report on El Salvador removed reproductive rights and any mention of these women. This decision empowers those in El Salvador who would like to keep these women and others like them behind bars. These women deserve to be seen and to be heard. The State Department's failure to report on these injustices doesn't mean they aren't happening. It just means the State Department won't acknowledge these injustices publicly. The Reproductive Rights or Human Rights Act would put an end to this by protecting public reporting and ensuring that all human rights violations are identified. Thank you again to the members of Congress, and I'll pass things over to Planned Parenthood.
Did you want to say something?
Please go ahead.
Well, I am so proud to be a co-sponsor with Representative Clark on this legislation. We stand in solidarity with our sisters around the world. As this Trump administration seeks every angle to limit not only American women, but women around the world of their reproductive rights or even information so that we know what's going on, we think that we can do better, that we have to do better. And so our representatives in Congress, especially the women, are joining with Katherine Clark to say, we want that information. It saves lives, it saves women, and we are going to be standing with our sisters. Thank you.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Good afternoon. My name is Dana Singheiser. I'm the Senior Vice President for Policy, Campaigns, and Advocacy at Planned Parenthood. It is heartening to stand here today alongside our partners and our fierce reproductive health champions in Congress, all to demand that the State Department shed light on abuses on reproductive rights around the globe. I want to thank Senator Blumenthal, Congresswoman Clark, Congresswoman Schakowsky, so glad you could join us, Senator Menendez, and I think Congresswoman Lee, who just had to leave, for their leadership and for joining us in shedding light onto this important issue. At Planned Parenthood, we know that reproductive health care is health care, that women's health care is health care, and that health care is a human right. It is outrageous that the State Department would remove reproductive rights from their annual reporting on human rights, signaling to the world that these rights don't matter. Nothing could be further from the truth, and we will not stand for that. We know that this action is part of a broader ideological agenda that the Trump-Pence administration has been pushing here at home and around the globe to take away reproductive rights and health since day one. President Trump, of course, began his administration by reinstating and radically expanding the global gag rule. The global gag rule forces health providers to deny abortion services, counseling, and referrals to their patients, and it prevents advocates from working to expand reproductive rights in their own countries. Health providers have to make the impossible choice of being censored from providing information or to stop participating in programs that serve women around the globe who already face the greatest barriers to care. And of course, it doesn't stop there. Over the past 2 years, we've seen this administration try to roll back access to health care, including at Planned Parenthood. This administration is trying to erase the existence of transgender people, embracing racist and discriminatory policies, and attacking immigrant communities. As if that weren't enough, the White House forced through a Supreme Court justice who we know will gut the monumental case of Roe v. Wade. Just last week, the administration released a domestic gag rule that would effectively dismantle Title X, the nation's birth control and reproductive health care program. And just like the global gag rule, this policy forces health providers to make that impossible choice of being censored from providing referrals for abortion or to stop participating in a program that serves 4 million low-income women, men, and young people. We know that this is not what people want. Last November, voters across the country made it clear that they want their members of Congress to protect their health and rights. They want their representatives to protect their access to birth control. They want to be able to talk to their doctor about their health care options, and they want to make their own health care decisions with the best information possible. It doesn't sound very radical to me. This legislation pushes back against the efforts to erode our health and rights. And by supporting this bill today, we are affirming that everyone has the right to decide if and when to start a family and to make decisions about their bodies. I look forward to working with our members of Congress to advance this bill and get it signed into law. And at this point, I want to turn it over to my partner, Amanda Classing at Human Rights Watch.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm Amanda Classing. I am acting co-director of the Women's Rights Division at Human Rights Watch, and I want to say thank you again to Senator Blumenthal, to Representative Clark, to Representative Schakowsky, and Senator Menendez, and of course to Representative Lee, and all of our human rights champions on the Hill. Human Rights Watch documents human rights abuses around the world. You could say human rights reporting is what we do. And last year, when the Trump administration cut most mentions of the human rights abuses that disproportionately impact women and girls around the world, including country-level analysis of maternal mortality and unmet contraceptive needs, we were worried. Women's rights are often undermined at the individual level, but you can't see it except in the aggregate data, which has previously been included in these reports, and they can reveal terrible trends of discrimination and neglect by the state. It took decades for the human rights movement and governments to realize this. But for at least the last 25 years, there's been broad recognition that enabling women's reproductive rights can positively impact their other fundamental human rights. And the reverse can also be true. Women dying in childbirth is an excellent example of this. What was long understood as a family tragedy or a public health crisis has now slowly been recognized also to be a failure of human rights obligations. Human rights investigations of maternal death have revealed that when women die from preventable pregnancy-related diseases or causes, there are policies, practices, and laws that created that environment in which their life was not valued. Too often, no one is held accountable for their death. And as a human rights researcher, I have had the opportunity to both interview victims of state-sponsored torture and women who have had to give birth on the street because they can't afford to enter a hospital. And I can tell you that their experience of that human rights abuse is the same, regardless of whether they're the victim of torture or they've had to face struggles in accessing maternal health care. The administration has made this draconian edit to the human rights reports at a time when the U.S. has also expanded its draconian policy, the global gag rule, that limits assistance to foreign organizations that play an important role in reducing global maternal death. We all have universal human rights, and that includes deciding when to become parents, how many children to have, and surviving childbirth. When governments limit women's reproductive rights, they also restrict their economic, social, and political rights. We welcome Congress stepping in to ensure that the State Department does not erase or turn a blind eye to some of the greatest threats to women's fundamental human rights. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you to everyone, and we'd be happy to take a few questions. Yes.
The party of what? No, I think that we are the party of life. We're the party that wants to make sure that when a child is born, it has the ability to fulfill its God-given potential, to get the health care it needs, to get the education it needs, to help mothers during maternal care, to make sure that they can have a healthy child and survive the birth of that child. So this is a party that continuously supports making sure that women have the rights to make decisions, that when they make a decision to have a child, that they have all the help necessary to have a healthy child, and that that healthy child can fulfill their God-given potential. I wish our colleagues would join us in all elements of that.
Thank you. Yes.
Well, there will be bipartisan support. The only question is whether there's enough to carry it across the finish line and to survive a veto, if there is one. The Republicans are painting themselves into an unsustainable corner. Literally, they are narrowing their base of support to an untenable position. And this measure really is about information. It's about knowing what's happening in the world, opening our eyes, and hearing and seeing what's happening to women and children around the world. And so it's really about life. It's about what quality of life women and children, young girls have all around the globe. To refuse to support it, I think, is shameful. And I would anticipate we're going to have a lot of bipartisan support. And I hope that it perhaps provides a template or a path forward on other issues where reproductive rights and women's health care is at stake.
Thank you, everybody, for a wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, take care. See you back.
Good to see you.
Back in the chamber.
Congresswoman,
Thank you
great
so
job.
much.
How are you?
Thank you so much.
Good to see you again. How are you?